Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the February 16th, 2018 edition of the Intuit Developer Friday Morning Hangout. I'm your host, David Leary. I'm the Intuit's Global Small Business Ecosystem Evangelist. You can follow me on Twitter at David Leary. Today we have a special guest. Tony Chang is going to come on. He's a product manager at Intuit. He's going to do an encore presentation of his QuickBooks Connect presentation that's about data integrations at Delight. Also could be known as stage transactions. So it's really exciting. There's some new API functionality we're working on we want to share with you, and Tony's going to do that in a little bit. Before that, just a couple housekeeping announcements and give people a chance to finish joining this morning. If you have any general chats, use the chat panel. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel along the way. If you're watching on Facebook Live, which we are now broadcasting to every Hangout now, you could use the comments actually on the Facebook Live feed as well. And for those of you watching this on YouTube after the fact, you can always just hit the forums on the developer site. And if I click my slide, we'll go to the next slide. There we go. Just a reminder, as always, for the third year in a row, we are doing the $100,000 Small Business App Showdown. You have 180 days left to get your app submitted to apps.com, published live on apps.com, and you agreeing and entering the contest. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the top 10 finalists to QuickBooks Connect. You'll pitch with a chance to win $100,000. And it's not just about really the money or winning the $100,000. We're doing a bunch of extra promotion for the finalists. For example, we were at Startup Grind earlier this week, and we took the finalists from the previous year there and got them a lot more exposure. Getting them exposed to other startups, getting them exposed to other new small businesses, getting them exposed to other VC firms and things like that. So there's overall a lot of extra promotion for the apps, and this is a good way for newer developers to kind of get some exposure, because it does get hard. Like if you're coming in new and there's 500 apps on apps.com, how do you get some attention? And this is one way we're helping you do that. So 180 days left, publish your app, get it on apps.com. And like I mentioned, we're going to take developers to QuickBooks Connect. So put this on your calendar, November 5th through the 7th in San Jose. This is the big event. About 5,000 people to 6,000 people show up. You have accountants, you have small business owners, you have developers. It's the entire QuickBooks ecosystem all in one place under one roof. And we will have sessions that are dedicated specifically to developer content. So you can come in and attend that conference, put it on your calendar. It's definitely one of the places to be this year. And for those of you that happen to be in the London area in the UK, we are coming to London. I think next week, essentially. I think I fly out 5 days from now. We're doing 2 events. We're going to do our hackathon, which actually is the next slide. And then we're also going to do a QuickBooks Connect event. It's interesting, when I took this screenshot of the video screen, the guys that are right there, they happen to be the hackathon winners from last year, Arbitrue. And they came to the hackathon, they built an app, they won the hackathon. A year later, they're going to go live on apps.com sometime next week. So it's a really cool story. And like you as a developer, if you came to the hackathon, that could be you next year, right? 1 year later, you could be on apps.com. And like I just mentioned, the hackathon, so those of you in London or can get to London, come next Saturday and Sunday, you can win £5,000. All you have to do is build a solution for a small business, just solve a small business problem. And we have some great partners that are joining us. Clarify AI, which takes photo images and analyzes them. We have Estimote, which are like little low voltage Bluetooth type devices that have lots of sensors in them, so you can sense movement, motion, and temperature, and those types of environmental variables. And they all talk to each other, and it kind of creates these like mesh networks. It's really, really cool. And then we have Nexmo, which is really voice and text enabled APIs. To communication APIs, if you want to think of it that way. And then also we have the QuickBooks API available. So lots of different companies. It's a lot of fun. We feed you well, lots of prizes. So if you're in the London area, you definitely want to show up to this next week. And like always, this and all the other events that we do are always going to be found on the developer page on the hub. So it's developer.intuit.com/hub/events. And you can check out all the upcoming webinars and things that we have coming up. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing. And Tony, if you want to go off and mute for a moment, we'll get you introduced.
Okay.
Good morning, Tony. I think you've done this before, right? I think you've been on.
Yeah, once. Maybe like a couple of years ago. Maybe.
Okay. Sorry. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. Really looking forward to your presentation today. I mean, I've seen it before, and I know that there's some stuff in the stage transactions, which is really game changing. So I'm going to hand off to you. I'll give you a chance to share. Yep. And while you're doing that, just a reminder, everybody, if you have questions that are on the topic, use the Q&A panel. If it's just general chatting, please use the the chat function. And whenever you're ready, Tony.
Cool. Great. Hope everyone can see my slides.
You're good.
Today I'm going to be presenting the presentation that I made at QuickBooks Connect in November. So this presentation really is all about how we at Intuit are thinking about data integrations with QuickBooks. So we've had our APIs out there for a while, and we've seen plenty of various integrations that developers have built. And so we've taken a lot of that input from our customers and also from our developers, and really learned what it takes to build a really, really great integration that will get a lot of users and help them solve a lot of their day-to-day business problems. So today I'm going to go through some of those learnings that we've seen from other applications on our platform, some tips on how you can actually build a really great data integration with QuickBooks. And then I'm going to go into what we call our Stay Transactions platform, which is a new integrations platform that will actually turn into a new API for us to allow developers to integrate with QuickBooks in a much more easier way, leading to a better data integration. So I'm going to go through a little bit about how we came up with this concept, what Stay Transactions means, and what it could mean for your applications. So to start, go through a really high level around QuickBooks integrations in general. The vast variety of our applications on our QuickBooks platform are data integrations, and the majority are actually bringing data into QuickBooks through our accounting APIs. And this can range from things like e-commerce integrations, invoicing, time, vendor payments, etc. And of course, we also have a number of integrations which uses the data within QuickBooks for externalizing insights, usage for tax reporting, or even a lot of applications use our data to help small businesses gain funding. So this is the ecosystem as we see it today, and really it is powered by data integrations. So a really quick quote from one of our customers that uses a particular app on our platform. He says, "We used to burn up so much manpower keeping the books lined up with Amazon. Easily the most dreaded task in the office. Now we can keep the Amazon settlements up to date and accurate, only spending a few minutes a month on it." And this is the kind of benefit that we want app integrations to be able to deliver, and we want developers to be able to power this type of vast time savings through automation, through integration of data, helping small businesses save hours each month. But it doesn't always work out well, right? This is another piece of feedback that our small business customer has gave on a particular integration, saying it doesn't sync customer information, doesn't correctly sync sales, might as well manually enter them if I have to make the above corrections. So whilst we're taking an ambitious step of trying to automate work for small businesses all around the world, it's important that we do it correctly, and it's important that we hit that goal, right? Because if you are automating information, you're trying to save time, but it's not working correctly, that might actually end up costing small businesses more than what they bargained for. And as a result, they'll be turned off and turned away from your particular integration. So, we've seen integrations both do things very well, and we've seen integrations where there's a lot of improvement that we can make. So I'm going to talk through some of the things that we see that makes up a typical integration with QuickBooks, and things that as an app developer you might want to keep an eye on. So first of all, and often this is something that is overlooked, or as a developer might be, you might pass that on to a marketing person, or maybe a business person within the company. But the discovery and connection piece of an integration is so important. That is where you are making the promise. So you are telling the customer, whether it's through an app store listing, or maybe it's a landing page on your integration site, or maybe it's the first page where you see when they decide to connect that integration, This is where you are delivering that message on what your integration is going to do and what you are promising to do. And that's setting the expectation for the customer. And it's really important to not get mixed up in, marketing mumbo jumbo. There's a time and place for that. But when a user is about to initiate a connection that's going to fundamentally, change the way their QuickBooks operates, maybe it starts automating some data, it's really important to be extremely clear on what are they connecting, what's going to happen when they connect, what's the benefit that they're going to get. And so clarity on things like what types of transactions or what type of data will be synced, at what time period, what control will they have, what customization will they have. Those are really important things to list out, and make sure you are making that very clear in that discovery and connection process. And we've seen some apps do that very well, even just through our QuickBooks App Store on their app listing. They have very clear explanation on how their integration works, and what they can do, what a user can do with that integration. And just for those who don't know, recently we did upgrade our app listings on our QuickBooks App Store to contain a slightly different format. So in the past, you were able to put a description and various paragraphs detailing how the integration works. We've now taken this feedback, and on our app listings, newer app listings, you'll see that a lot of developers are now able to put a particular section on how the integration works. So apart from being able to market and describe what your application does, you can also describe how it integrates with QuickBooks, which is extremely important. Next is the first time use. So, we have so many different small businesses on our platform at various levels of expertise. We also have pro advisors and accountants on the platform. So the first time use experience is really important. And it's important that you consider what type of users will be connecting your application. Some users are extremely familiar with accounting concepts. They may even be familiar with integrations in general. And so they'll know what you mean when you ask them to configure a particular setting, or tell them that they need to set up taxes, or something like that. But there are a lot of users who are using QuickBooks, perhaps they've only started in the last year or in the last few months, and they're not that familiar with all of the various accounting concepts, QuickBooks concepts, and much less understand what a data integration actually is. And so we find it useful, and we've found some apps that do this really well, in showing what the integration does, either visually or perhaps through a video. And it's important for the user to actually get to the benefit that you promised in a pretty short amount of time, right? If they're sitting around spending 20 minutes getting through a setup before they get to any benefit, then they might decide that this time is not worth their investment. And so it's important to be able to actually visualize and show what your app is going to do. And one way we've seen this is through screenshots, even during the setup flow, telling people or showing users how data is going to show up in QuickBooks. So using imagery versus descriptions. It's obviously easy to write a lot of textual explanation, but we've seen that video or images work a lot better with a lot of our users. And then lastly is the actual integration itself and how you sync data or send and retrieve data into or out of QuickBooks. So settings is a concept that most integrations have, and settings allows you to configure the integration to meet various users' needs. And it's important here, what I want to call out is to find a balance between being able to customize, but keeping it simple. So there are applications which I've seen that offer very, very little customization. So you basically connect the application, you maybe have 1 or 2 settings you can tweak, and then it starts to operate the way it was designed. That usually ends up in an application that works well for a very, very specific set of users. And when that happens, you're able to deliver a benefit to those specific set of users, but then you inevitably will get other types of companies, small businesses who discover the integration, start using it, and have a bad experience because they're not able to customize the integration to their needs. On the flip side, I've also seen integrations that when you click connect, the next thing you see is a screen where you have 30 different settings that you need to set up. And a small business has no idea how to navigate through those settings. So one way we've seen that has worked well is to really figure out what needs to be shown in the first time setup of the integration, and then hide some of the advanced settings until later on. So advanced users can discover more customization options later on through your integration, but you get what you need during the first time use experience. Exception handling is another one that the great integrations do very well. Inevitably, you'll encounter edge cases, error cases, situations where things you were expecting to exist in the user's QuickBooks company, like a specific account in their chart of accounts, or maybe a specific type of value in their QuickBooks, and it's not there. With data integrations, users can modify their QuickBooks companies as they see fit. So you can't expect everything to stay constant. And it's important to be able to handle these types of exceptions in a seamless way. So number one is to actually handle these exceptions. So making sure you're aware of edge cases that can potentially happen, such as an account or maybe a payment method or a customer being deleted, or maybe the name gets changed. That's something that's pretty frequently that we see. So handling those exceptions, but secondarily actually surfacing some of these errors to the user. So in some cases, you might want to let the user fix these problems themselves. So a very easy example is integrations that try to create a customer or vendor in QuickBooks, and there's already another one with the same name. And perhaps the user has entered the customer or vendor themselves. Maybe they entered it actually as a vendor when you want to use it as a customer. These exceptions happen pretty frequently. And that's actually an exception that the user themselves can address with the right explanation. You can tell the user to rename, or you can ask the user, do they want to use a different name for the data that you're trying to sync? But being able to surface these errors and exceptions to the user, A, it gives the small business or accountant feeling of control, and B, it allows you to basically explain what is happening to the user so that they're not surprised if there's data that hasn't been sent to QuickBooks, or if the integration has been in an error state for the last couple of cycles. You don't want to catch them by surprise finding out that they're paying for an integration that hasn't been working. You want to be proactive about notifying them. And notifying them can happen in different ways. It could happen via email. That's been effective for a number of applications. It could happen on your own application's dashboard. There's various ways of notifying the user, but it's important that it happens. So I want to jump into an example of an integration that we've looked at on our platform. I'm actually going to show some screenshots here. So this is a Shopify integration between Shopify and QuickBooks. And this is actually the first screen that you see when you're integrating with QuickBooks and Shopify. And so, this is an example of an integration that has made sure that it asks the user for input during the first time setup, which is great. The opportunity here is that there are quite a lot of settings that most QuickBooks users probably aren't going to know how to configure. So there are some things like the first one, product sales. That's fairly easy for a typical small business. We're asking them what account they want to attribute their income to. Now, the second one, PayPal deposits. That's something that's stranger for some users. So if I'm using Shopify, why is there a setting for PayPal here? So what this integration is actually asking is, if you're processing payments through PayPal on Shopify, where do you want those to go? But this is an example of something that might not be clearly understandable for the typical small business user. And the last one, again, payment deposits. So, you might wonder, what is the difference between a payment deposit and a PayPal deposit? Again, there's opportunity here to be a little clearer on what type of payment deposits are they referring to. They say it's for all sales. Is it including PayPal sales or not? That's something that can be improved here. And there's actually a lot more settings on this screen. It goes all the way through, configuring taxes, configuring how products are exported, configuring how customers are exported. So I do like that they have gone through each of the various areas of this data integration. They're very clear in what setting that the user wants to put. And for the remainder of these, there is actually some good clarity on what is the choices available to the user. Even things like whether they want to export automatically, do they want to receive notifications? So these are all really great things to allow the user to configure to make sure that A, they know what to expect from the integration, and B, they have the ability to configure it to what they want. And I think the opportunity here is just to make sure it's a little simpler and clearer for beginner users of QuickBooks. That's something that often we see integrations don't anticipate, which is just how new a particular small business trying to connect a particular integration might be. We see so many new QuickBooks users all the time, and that's related to some of the growth that we're seeing in the QuickBooks ecosystem. But that means there's a lot of new small businesses who maybe they haven't even touched QuickBooks. They didn't even know we have a QuickBooks desktop. They haven't been using QuickBooks for very long. Maybe they just started their business recently. A lot more businesses are now using cloud software, and so they have a much bigger need for integrations, but at the same time, they're new. So a lot of the wording, the language, and the ease of use needs to be tailored for these new users. So 3 kind of summary tips for that great integration that if I were an integration developer, I would keep an eye on. One is error cases. We always design well for the happy path as integration developers, but there are always going to be error cases, and those things can make or break an integration. And by anticipating what type of errors can arise from the API, putting in things like retry logic or maybe capabilities to undo certain actions, and then surfacing the resolution methods to the user. Sometimes the user can actually address problems themselves. At other times, your integration might want to handle it. But it's important to be able to notify the user if something has not worked the way they expected. Clear data mapping, and as shown in that previous example, being clear to the user how the integration is going to work. All of our data integrations, although they're all putting data in or taking data out of QuickBooks, it's quite different if you go from integration to integration on how it operates. Some integrations have an ongoing sync that's always bringing in data into QuickBooks. Some are actually integrations where you have to, as a user, click a button to send data over to QuickBooks. So it's not always the same. And the level of detail is also not always the same. So it's important for the user to understand what your integration will do. And then providing customization and settings. These things are important for your app integration to be able to scale to different types of QuickBooks companies. And as I mentioned, we're getting more and more QuickBooks users day by day. We're also getting more variety of different QuickBooks types of companies. Companies that have brick and mortar storefronts. Some companies are cloud only, project-based businesses, product-based businesses. A lot of times these companies, although they're in very, very different areas, industries, they're using the same cloud tools. And so for your app and your integration, you need to consider how you can customize or personalize the data for different types of QuickBooks companies. So an example of what might be a really great integration. So in this case, let's say the user's trying to connect to PayPal, and they're trying to get data from PayPal into QuickBooks. Wouldn't it be nice if all you had to ask is, where do you want your transactions to go? And when do you want your transactions to start importing? This is the kind of data integration that we think we can build for our developers and for our users as we move into the future. And that's the perspective and lens that we're going at this problem. In terms of how do we make data integration so simple for our QuickBooks users that even beginner QuickBooks users are able to sign up for QuickBooks, connect all the various applications and data sources that they have, and have no fear or no hesitation on trying new apps and trying new tools and getting them linked to QuickBooks. And that requires us fundamentally changing how our integration or how our API platform works. So this screenshot here is actually from an integration that we're working on right now. It is an API integration that brings in data from PayPal into QuickBooks. And it's actually a product that's right now live in beta with our customers. And you can just see from these two screenshots that we barely have to ask the customers for any type of setting, customization, all the things that you saw in the previous Shopify example. We don't need to ask the customer that. And yet we're able to deliver a great customer experience. So how are we doing this? This new integration is being built on our new Stage Transactions platform. So with the Stage Transactions platform, I want to talk about what we're trying to solve and what's going to be different in this platform than what you are familiar with our accounting APIs. So we know that the accounting APIs can be hard to understand. You basically need to know how QuickBooks works. You need to know the various data types of QuickBooks and the various workflows that users have to go through in order to get data in correctly. With Stage Transactions, we want to simplify that. We believe that if you're an application and you have data that your users want to sync into QuickBooks, that it should be extremely easy for you as a developer to provide that link and provide that connection to have data flow into QuickBooks. And we believe that as a developer, you shouldn't have to be an expert at using QuickBooks just to send data in. Being complete and correct with the data. As I mentioned, a lot of integrations solve really well for certain users. They're able to save users many hours through automation. But on the flip side, there are also times when integrations actually add more work when the data is wrong. And so this is another problem that the Stage Transactions platform will solve. I'll show you later how we're trying to think of the data automation problem as developers being able to provide the data easily into QuickBooks. And then when the user needs to provide some input or maybe provide some edits or changes to that data, they can do so in an easy way. I'll go through what that will look like on this Stage Transactions platform. And lastly is personalization. So even though in the screenshots that I show, we did not have to ask the customer many questions, we're going to be able to customize the integration to tailor to different types of QuickBooks users. So what is this Stage Transactions platform? So at a very high level, it is a new API that we're working on. And that API is behind or is in front of a platform that we have within QuickBooks, our internal platform. So in the past, you're familiar with applications. When you build an integration, you're using our V3 APIs and you're writing directly into QuickBooks accounting. So you're writing accounting transactions into the ledger, you're reading accounting transactions from the ledger, or you're creating customers and name list entities into our accounting system. And that's great for automating work, but it's also highly risky because if you don't know all the details of what needs to go into the accounting ledger, then you need to either ask the user, which results in a lot of settings and a lot of steps, or you need a guess, which might result in incorrect data. So with state transactions, we're saying that we'll expose a new API that will allow you to pass data in through this new API. And then behind the scenes, QuickBooks will do work such as auto-categorizing the transactions that come in from your integration, figuring out what accounts should be applied based on the data that is in your transaction, figuring out if there's any duplicates with what the user already has in their books with the data that you're passing in. And then also surfacing through a user interface, allowing the user to review the data that's coming in specifically from your application and making sure everything is correct in their books. So there's a lot there, but I'll jump firstly into the API interface. So if you're familiar with our accounting V3 APIs, they are fairly strict, extremely strict, in fact. You know, if you've played around with our sandbox or you've built an integration before, you'll know that there's a lot of validation in our APIs, both from a business logic standpoint and also from a formatting standpoint. So you really need to understand what to put in each field, what formats are supported, and there's also a lot of reference IDs you need to pass. So if I was to create an invoice in our V3 API, I need to know what customer to put on that invoice. I need to go and fetch the customer ID and put it in the request object when I'm trying to create that invoice. So those things are some barriers to keeping our API simple. So with the state transactions API, the concept here is that this API really is an API that just accepts data to come into our system. So there are various fields for various types of data. On the right, you can see some custom fields, places where you can put references, display names. You can put the lines of what is in a particular transaction, memo, transaction date, things that you're typically familiar with. But you can see there that there is no internal QuickBooks IDs required. So I can basically pass raw data through this API interface and have that be accepted into the QuickBooks system. So I might not know if Tony Chang already exists in QuickBooks or not, or what the customer ID is. That's okay. I just need to give the data that I have in my system and pass it through this API interface. And because we allow you to do that, there will be much lighter validation here. And it's much easier to just take the data that you have in your system and send it through this state transaction API. And have it result in the same type of data that you would have created if you went through the typical V3 interface. And then you might wonder, how would we do that? If I'm not giving all of the reference ID, if I'm not providing all of the details, if I'm not providing the accounting category, how do we make sure it ends up correct? And that's where that intelligence, that smart platform comes in. So you might already know that in QuickBooks, when you connect a bank to QuickBooks, what we're getting from the bank, we're really only getting an amount, a date, and a description. And yet, a lot of our users prefer to get data through the banking connection, and we're able to accurately categorize a lot of that data. And the way we do that is through some of the intelligence that we have on our platform. So being able to see if there's data coming in that you sent, is it duplicating with anything that's already in their books? Being able to surface to the customer that, hey, we actually saw that the customer you passed in doesn't exist. And we can surface that to the user of QuickBooks to ask them, do they want to create a new customer, or do they want to add a new customer into QuickBooks? Doing these kind of things within the product and making sure that it's our QuickBooks responsibility of doing this means it's easier for developers to build integrations. And being able to auto-categorize based on the data that the user already has in their company, as well as the data that has been passed in by your data requests. So if you tell us who the vendor is, what the amount was, what the line items were, we can use those pieces of data to piece together what the likely category the user would want to place for this particular item. And this allows for a lot more customization. Instead of putting everything into a default category, which is what a lot of our data integrations do, we can now be a lot more smart and personalized. And the best thing is, as a developer, you don't need to worry about this. You can simply pass that data to us, and we will do it on our platform. An example of just the previous example where I passed in a object where the vendor or the contact on that transaction was Tony's custom coffee. If we send that to our categorization engine, it can tell us that the likely category is going to be meals and entertainment for that expense. Control and confidence was another area I touched on, being able to configure app settings and being able to give users the ability to review transactions coming from an integration before it goes into their books. So app settings has typically been something that developers have had to build. So when you want to build an integration with QuickBooks, you usually have to build a new screen in your application to handle all of the different settings that you might want your integration to have. So with state transactions, we're also going to be exposing endpoints that allow you to actually save those settings within QuickBooks. So you can actually define your own custom settings that you need for your particular integration. And these settings might be asking, setting, what type of expense account to use for certain items, such as in the PayPal case, for PayPal fees, what expense account does the user want to use? That's something that the user can specify and configure, that your application doesn't need to try and guess. And these settings, instead of having to find or build a UI for this and find a place to save these settings, you can actually save these settings within the state transactions platform. So you can define 4 settings here. You can define what type of types are available for this setting, like is the setting for a bank account, is it for an expense account, is it for a shipping, is it an item type setting? You can set Boolean settings or drop-down type settings. But basically, we want to be able to provide that ability for you to offer customization, but have that in QuickBooks so that it's easier for the user to find. And also, you don't have to worry about creating another screen on your application just to handle QuickBooks. And then obviously, you can read those settings from the platform and then send data as appropriate back to QuickBooks. Further on into the future, another concept that we're thinking about is actually rules. So actually for you to be able to define certain rules that will operate on the data that you're pushing in, so that you don't even have to read those settings back. What if you could just define a rule saying, if X data equals a certain value, then set that data to a setting that the user has provided. So this is thinking a little bit more into the future on how we can simplify integrations even more. So instead of you having to write a lot of custom logic on your application to handle these various use cases, what if you can just provide QuickBooks with certain rules that you want us to run when your data comes in, and have those rules be applied and modify your data in certain ways. So instead of you having to figure out what does this particular user want the PayPal fees to be, and you have to persist that setting or remember that configuration for that user, what if you can just define this as a rule in the QuickBooks platform and have that setting automatically be applied? And again, this is something that has never been available for developers, but this is a capability we already have. If you played around with our banking integrations, we already have the ability to create rules on data that's coming in We've just never considered exposing this as a capability for developers. And with state transactions, that's another facet that we are currently exploring and designing. So if you think about what you have to do as an app developer today, today you have to get data into QuickBooks or figure out how to transfer data into QuickBooks. You also have to figure out how to make sure the accounting entries are correct and making sure that users are satisfied with the way data is imported. And you have to make sure that user A and user B is both satisfied. With the state transactions platform, we're basically saying we want the app developer to be able to focus on getting app data correctly into our system, but we will take on more responsibility in figuring out how to make sure the accounting entries are complete and correct, and the user has confidence, and make sure that the different types of businesses on QuickBooks are satisfied with your integration. So state transactions platform is basically us taking the initiative of building more intelligence into our platform so that developers can have an easier time sending data into QuickBooks, and us together with the data that you have sent, figuring out how to record the accounting entries correctly for the different types of users on our platform. So fundamentally rethinking how data integrations can be made and hopefully for the better. And providing that user control is at the heart of all this. So all of the automation that I talked about, whether it's the auto categorization or rules that the user can define, we always allow the QuickBooks user or their accountant to have the final say. So being able to allow users to override logic that has been automated, and also surfacing transactions to the user on the UI so that they know what data is being passed. And just quickly to end this section, showing you what we've done with our integration so far. So this platform is not just a concept, it already exists. We are using it ourselves, as I mentioned, to build our new PayPal integration. And so let me share a couple of screens on what that looks like. So give me a second as I switch windows. Great. Let me change the tab here.
And so, Tony, while you're switching windows and logging in on that, I just want to clarify something. I make sure I'm making a correct observation. So, best way I can relate this: developers are going to do kind of this scenario. So, like on the Xbox, right? So, we're talking video games here, right? I can go into my Xbox and I can configure my controller one way for race car games, another way for maybe sports games, and then maybe another way for a different type of games. And so then every time I get a race car game, it just uses those settings from the control, like that are just stored. So we're kind of doing that same thing for devs. Me as a QuickBooks user, I can set up, hey, I always want these types of things to go to this specific expense account. So instead of me telling every single app about that, they can just read it once from my QuickBooks and they're going to post to the right place.
Exactly. I think the concept here is that our platform, within QuickBooks, we know more about the user than what we typically have exposed through APIs, right? So we know what accounts that the user has connected. We know that in the past, what does this user typically categorize particular expenses at, or what do they typically categorize particular income accounts as? So we have that within our system, and so we're better able to make inferences on how the user wants their data to be recorded in the accounting system. And I think one thing I didn't mention is, whilst the state transactions platform allows you to be very flexible and generic in the way you pass data into QuickBooks, you can also still be specific. So if your system or your application does know exactly what customer or what item that you want this data to have, you can pass that in our system, and great. That means you have already specified pieces of data that you know for sure that the user wants to, the user prefers. We will respect those, and it means we won't do any additional work or processing on top of that. Example here on this screen is a PayPal connection that is actually going through our state transactions platform. So as I mentioned before, we are pulling data from PayPal's APIs and we are pushing the data through the state transactions platform. So number one here is you can see that this is the same user interface as the banking user interface. So all of the transactions that I have pushed in via the staged API are visible on the UI before it hits the accounting ledger. So the user can go through and verify if things are correct or not. And you can see that we've automatically assigned categories to these transactions. When we pulled this data from PayPal, we actually didn't know what these categories were. And we did not have to guess either. The platform is doing this automatically. And some examples of what else we can do here. If I go into the settings for this integration, actually I'll show you first with the connection here. It is very similar to our typical OAuth connection. And so you are giving permission as you do today with your data integrations. But as I showed before, we really only have two settings that we need to ask of the user. What account do they want the data to go into and what their start date is. And then all of the data later on is automatically loaded through the state transactions platform with additional information supplied. So in cases where, let's say, Intuit Cafe is already a vendor in my QuickBooks system, then this has been automatically applied as the vendor. When the data was passed in from PayPal, they did not know if Intuit Cafe exists in QuickBooks or not, but the system is automatically searching to see if there's any matching vendors or customers and applying that to those transactions. And again, right now, this interface is very similar to the banking interface. But as we onboard more applications and more use cases, we will also evolve this user interface to take into account of different types of application, whether it's applications that deal with sales tools, expenses, inventory, things like that. We will gradually expose those different UI elements through the state transactions platform. Other examples here of what we've done, being able to match transactions. So instead of the PayPal integration, putting a duplicate for a sale that might already be in the user's books, we're able to surface that, hey, we actually found sales receipts that match the amount and date and the transaction details here. So we can have the user match those transactions together instead of putting duplicates into the system. And that's something that plagues a lot of data integrations today, is having duplicate transactions come in from various sources, especially other banks that are connected to QuickBooks. So that's something that we can solve with state transactions. And as you can see here, we've brought in a lot of data from PayPal in this account and being able to place it all within QuickBooks in a temporary holding state for the user to review and add, match, or add transfers into the QuickBooks as they see fit. And that's also an interface that users are already familiar with as they have interacted with banking in the past. So unlike today's integrations where everything's either happening behind the scenes or they have to navigate through settings that they're not very familiar with, this is a familiar interface to our QuickBooks users. And so it's easier for them to understand how to actually process or review the data that's coming in from an external source. That's all I wanted to go through from today from my standpoint. There's definitely a lot more going into this platform that I've been able to talk about. And it's an ongoing project. So we've decided that we were going to dog food the platform first with our own integration. So we've been building our PayPal integration on top of this new platform. And what's going to happen next is we're going to explore various developer third-party use cases and keep expanding the platform to cater to various use cases, and then of course expose this platform to developers to use. Great. Should we move on to any questions?
Yeah, let's open the floor. I know some people, if there's any questions, please use the Q&A panel. Somebody made a comment there wondering about, they said they saw reference numbers and IDs, but not sure if they were setting on the correct screen. It's about 35 minutes in. Jack, I don't know if you want to, I can open up your mic, Jack, if you want to ask that question. Let me flip you over. Hey, Jack, your mic is live if you want to ask that question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, when I was looking at that screen, I seen things that looked like list IDs and reference numbers, and I was trying to understand if when we're creating these requests, whether or not we still have to get these IDs like we do now. I thought he said that he did not have to, so maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can go through that again. So you're correct in that you do not have to provide the reference IDs for the transaction. So if I go back to that example here, over here. So the IDs that you might have seen here, this is actually the ID from PayPal. So it's just the raw data that's coming from PayPal. These IDs are not QuickBooks IDs. So in this example, we're supplying them as a reference so that the user, if they need to, can match up the transaction in QuickBooks to the transaction in PayPal. So these are actually just raw data that is coming from PayPal.
Okay. So in other words, you're trying to go back the way it was with QuickBooks Desktop, where you can just pass it a name and not have to look up the ID first.
Right. With the addition that, although you are just passing in the name, we're going to have a couple of experiences around that. So in the case where we don't detect any matches, we might ask the user if they want to create a new entity based on some of the information that you've passed. So even though you've passed the name and maybe you've passed the address for this contact, and maybe you've even passed the email, and if none of these exists in QuickBooks, the user can, through the user interface, say, I want to add it. And when they add it, it will have all of the data that you've passed in as well. And then there's other use cases which I haven't shown here where maybe we do find a matching Tony Chang in QuickBooks already, or maybe we find two, because often we have names that are fairly similar, or we have email addresses that match fairly similarly. Then in that case, we'll surface a different user experience to the user, asking them to choose which is the correct customer. So again, something that the developer no longer has to worry about trying to get correct. That's something that we'll make sure we build in to the QuickBooks experience.
Okay, the things that we already programmed. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Jack actually answered another question. He was, I'm going to head him back to his regular. But people are asking the release date. Like what's the timeline on this? Some of the stage transaction functionality.
Yeah. So as with all things, we're starting from building up this platform first. And as I mentioned, we are dog fooding it ourselves. So we don't want to expose this out until we know that it actually works well and that it's ready. So the sequence of events is basically we're still in the beta phase for this PayPal integration. We're almost there at making this generally available. It's probably going to happen within the next month. And then we're going to start looking at some alternate use cases. So the answer of when it will be available for you depends on what type of use case that you might be looking to solve. So the folks here, David, I'm not sure if they're aware of the early access program that we have.
Oh yeah, I think we talked about that last week, or it's been put it in the.
Yeah.
I will add the URL in the chat and out on Facebook right now.
Yep. So we actually have an early access program, which is kind of like a beta program for developers to get a sneak peek at some of the upcoming APIs or enhancements that are coming to our platform. So the first developers that are going to get insight into the state transactions will be some of the developers that have already given us their interest through the early access program. So as part of the early access program, we'll also talk to you to understand what use cases you're trying to solve and what use case that your application might fit in, because we're going to be building out this platform use case by use case. The first use case we'll likely be focusing on are the sales and income use cases. So if you're an application that is today or looking to sync sales of different types, that's likely going to be the first use case we're going to solve. So if you are in our early access program and you have use cases around those, we definitely be glad to talk to you and make this API available to you early and collect feedback from you. So as I mentioned, we have the platform pieces there. We're cleaning it up for ourselves, making sure that it's clear for developers and also clear from an external standpoint. And then the first batch of early access developers will be given access to the APIs in order to provide us feedback. And then likely later in the year, we will have a much more broader set of users, developers that can have access to our state transactions API.
Got it. Great. So yeah, so I did save, put that link out there on the Facebook Live. Look down, you'll see the link. It's also in the chat as well for those of you that are actually in the webinar right now. The interesting with the V4 APIs and the staging, like we've been working with developers along the way. Instead of us like build the API, throw it out there, see what happens. We've been kind of, as we've been going along, we've been highly involved with developers. So I mean, I take you're talking to developers all the time about this.
Yep, exactly. We've already talked to multiple developers, both at QuickBooks Connect and then in the months following, around their various use cases for bringing data into QuickBooks and how we can apply state transactions and the capabilities we're building to their use cases. And we've seen different use cases. For some developers, that simplified API interface is going to be the main benefit, and not having to worry about various references. That's the main benefit they'll get. For other developers, they're really interested in the ability to have categories and fields automatically applied, because that's something that's plagued their own system in the past. And then there's other developers who are more interested in the settings features that I talked about, because they don't want to have to maintain their own settings on their side. So different developers definitely have interest in different areas of this, and that's why we want to learn more from our early access developers so that we can prioritize the features that matter most to you.
Got it. And then there's some questions about the SDKs. Obviously, eventually with V4, we'll probably have new SDKs that support V4. But what about stage transactions in SDKs? Is there specific considerations we have to take note of, or in theory, it'll just be like any other?
Yeah, it will be similar to, so state transactions itself is also a V4 API. It's in the V4 format, and it will be one of the endpoints that you can call with V4. So in terms of SDKs, when this state transaction becomes generally available, we will definitely also have that in our SDK so that it's easy for you to call the endpoints through the SDK and not having to navigate through the entire schema to construct your requests.
So we want to build a V4 API and then not include state transactions. Like anything that's in the V4 is going to get wrapped up into the SDK. Perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And different V4 endpoints are going to have different use cases. With state transactions, this use case is basically sending data in a way where the users can review the data and also have it go through our engine behind the scenes. There's obviously other V4 APIs for you to pull data out of QuickBooks, or maybe you have use cases where you're applying or saving transactions in a particular workflow, and you might want to use other endpoints. But for state transactions, we are foreseeing this as going forward, the main endpoint to use for sending data into QuickBooks.
Got it. Perfect. I don't think any other questions are coming in. Tony, thank you for coming today. We do appreciate it.
Yeah.
This is exciting. This is big for developers. If everybody has any questions beyond the early access, so they can obviously apply for that. What's the best way? Should they just reach out to you on Twitter?
Yeah, reaching out to me on Twitter works. I'm happy to answer any questions, or even if you want to chat about your use case, I'm definitely happy to do that. So I believe my Twitter is, you tweeted out my handle already.
Yeah, it's definitely on some of the tweets.
On the Intuit developer handle.
Yeah, I'm trying to see what it is exactly. Hold on. I have it right here. What is your handle? Let's just read it out to everybody. It's Tony Chang 107.
Yeah.
So yeah, go on there, follow him. You can ping him and ask him some questions there. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye everybody that's on Facebook Live, and all of you that are on YouTube. Hopefully we'll see you at one of these live in the future. Thanks everybody. Bye.
Thanks.